All right. What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Grab Your Torch with Caleb and Joel. We are here to recap episode 12 of Survivor 48, where I got to go watch at a watch party with uh where Mitch was there in Waco because he's kind of like the hometown hero around here. There isn't a lot of it's not a super big city at all, so it was cool to be able to show up. I went with some friends, and I didn't have a chance to meet him just because it was pretty packed in there. But it was cool to see him. He got to talk in between on the commercial breaks and stuff and share a little bit about his story, which was a lot of fun as well. Um, and the episode itself, the environment was really fun. Everyone was rooting for Mitch. So like every time they showed him doing something in the challenges, they would cheer for him, which was really fun. And then like booing for the other people too. So it was a fun environment to be a part of. And I actually enjoyed the episode a lot more than I had the last 2 weeks, which I think is probably the consensus. And I think this finale has the chance to be super entertaining and interesting. So, what were your thoughts on the episode?
Yeah, well, you were on reward, meeting Mitch and everything. I was just here watching the episode back at camp. But overall, I thought the episode was obviously a lot better. I don't know if this was the climactic, like, oh my gosh, this is it. Um, it didn't feel like Operation Italy, for example, where Operation Italy was like, is this actually gonna happen? But this did seem like Camilla and Kyle's like, this is their moment, like we've done all this stuff to like get someone out, and they took out Shaheen, which has been set up for a while now. So it was good to see some payoff there, and I think we're in for a very good finale. And honestly, I think the final five round is so indicative of what's going to happen.
In the
Um,
challenge?
oh
Is what
yeah,
you're saying? Yeah, I agree with that. And Joe has the chance here to break an immunity record if he wins the next two,
he might
which
as well
is,
have broken it. Like,
I know he's been out of his mind with the challenges, which has been really fun. But um, I think what I found most interesting about this episode was like probably just the Kyle and Camilla dynamic of everything. Um, they It's kind of a convoluted plan. Sometimes it was a little hard to hear because like it was just loud at the event and stuff. But um, basically, I understood that they're trying to plant Shaheen telling Camilla about an idol, which they told Joe about to kind of plant that line there. And then they also told him that, hey, he threw out Eva's name, which I do think if they just came to him and be like, hey, Shine threw out Eva's name, I think that could have like been a shot in the foot because, Joe would check with Shaheen on that, which he kind of did in a way, but it was kind of like he's kind of interrogating him, kind of not. So it was really interesting. And then I also thought it was strange, like, um, Shaheen still like seemed confident in everything as well. Even after that, he was questioning it a little bit, but he ended up just kind of trusting with it and deciding to vote on Mitch. So I'm not sure what the move was there. Like I don't know how to talk about these dynamics. I'm just a little still trying to wrap my head around what went down.
yeah, I think the best way we can go about this is kind of go in chronological order here. So we get to the reward. Shaheen finally wins a challenge, which was a massive deal for his story. He gets to win it with like I think a cyst on his wrist or something, which is I guess super painful. And he gets to get letters from home, all this stuff. And he specifically takes Joe and Kyle, which I thought was an interesting choice. Obviously, you know, Camilla was like, "Hey," like later on, she was like, "Hey, you just fed the challenge beast. Why did you
Right.
do that? And this is going to sink her game," which it eventually did. But I think the main thing here was Shaheen's talks with both Joe and Kyle, where Shaheen like kind of throws out like, "Hey, like, what about Kyle?" And Joe's like, "I think we could beat Kyle at the end." And then Shaheen's like, "Okay, okay." And then he's already kind of throwing stuff off with Joe, and then he talks to Kyle, and that's when things get like very messy. It kind of felt almost Tony-ish in a weird way, where like Tony was always looking for an excuse to vote someone off, and this was like Kyle being like, "You set it on me. I have all
Right.
the ammo
Right.
I need." So I think that's where it started.
I think also one of the most like fascinating aspects of this season is the jury. Like I feel like the jury hasn't been like such a topic of conversation before the finale as it has been this season, just with, we've seen David with his shenanigans last week, but also just like his mewing face the entire time that he's there. And then also like there's a real possibility that there's a bitter jury this season. More so bitter against Joe than anyone else. Like and Joe and Eva, if I'm being real, just because I know at this point Joe and Eva voted out two people in the five in the Honesty and Loyalty Alliance, which
Mhm.
on face value is not a bad game move, just because they're trying to get to the end themselves and win. But if they are doing that, they still lied to Shaheen. They didn't tell him that they're voting him out or whatever. They didn't tell David that they're planning to vote him out. It wasn't like it's still backstabbing, even though like they had a good reason to do it. So if Joe was actually honesty, integrity, he would have, when he confronted Shaheen, he would have actually told him, hey, like, this is what I heard. Is this true? And instead, he kind of danced around it and tried to ask the question, like to try to get him to confess it himself, which, you know, Joe didn't realize, like, if he was telling the truth that he's going to vote Mitch, like, he has no way of proving that. And
Yeah.
I think it was a little too late, by the time that Joe and Eva were having that talk on the beach, like before Tribal, about is Kyle and Camille like making this up? Is that a chance? And I think it was a little too late to go with that. I think they're already kind of set in stone with what they were going to do. So,
Yeah, I completely agree. This was a very convoluted thing, and honestly, I know why you had to do the reward, but man, I wish we could have had like 10 more minutes of them explaining like everything that's happening because this was a very complex round with Joe going around being detective, Camilla nearly dying from a branch, and so on and so forth. But I think this is like a very interesting round where everyone's kind of like taking off the gloves and they're like, we're going. And obviously, like Mitch, shout out to your boy, but like, why are you waiting till the final six to like actually make your move? Like,
right.
what are we doing? Because, like, for example, Kyle's been making moves the entire merge,
And
but
they're a
haven't.
little bit more subtly. We've had the Kyle confessional about it's about winning in the margins. I feel
Mhm.
like that's just how this season's played out overall. Like there hasn't been big move-itis from anyone. And so I don't think tonight's move was about making a big move. Even for Shaheen, he had that whole confessional about like, which is the title of the episode, Icarus time. Like, is this like, am I flying too close to the sun, or am I, being too patient? Which he was too patient. He got so comfortable, just with his alliance that he um, didn't do anything about that. And I think the time to take out Joe was last week. That was his chance. Like that was everyone's chance. And because they didn't do that, I feel like that really cornered Shaheen particularly into what his options were. If he was planning to get rid of Joe or Eva eventually, because at this point, it's final six. There's an idol. Joe's an immunity threat. It's pretty hard to go after them at that point, and you don't really want to go after Eva because she's beatable in the end. So you kind of want her to stick around so that you can, um, take her to the finals. You have two people in Mitch and Eva who at this point I don't really think have a shot to win, just based on, the edit and the way that their jury is, perceives them. And even though the castmates still talk about like, Kyle and Camilla were still like, Mitch is probably still a threat, because he has such a good story. But like your story can only get you so far, It's a really nice cherry on top, but if you have a game to back it up as well, is what really convinces the jury to win.
I completely agree. And on the topic of juries, like this is like everyone's like, oh, this is gonna be a very bitter jury. I think this is gonna be a very confrontational jury. I think it's gonna be a very aggressive one. Do I think a bitter one? I don't know. Because I think like for example, David and Marion, they're not voting Joe. But how we'll get to it like later. But like how I kind of see next round going is that like if Joe and Eva either of them win immunity, they've won the game. Where I think at that point they're taking Mitch and they're gonna be like Joe or Eva's gonna realize like, hey, like we gotta take out Camilla. Kyle's gonna try to stop it. Mitch is gonna save himself. And at that point, those two go back to back, and then you have a final three of Mitch, Eva, and Joe. And at that point, it's like there's no one to be bitter at because even though people were bitter at Boston Rob, they still voted for Boston Rob because he was against two goats.
Right,
And I think if Joe's going to win, that is his path. And I do think it's the most likely path.
right.
And why I think this move was also kind of seen as like, why didn't you vote out Eva? Because now you're really banking on one of you guys beating out Joe for immunity. And I do not know if they can do it. Kyle's really the only one right now
Yeah.
that
And it
Camilla too, but
they depend on the challenge as well,
sure.
At this point, I think we're really headed towards a Joe and Kyle in the final three. And, plug in Eva, plug in Mitch for the third person, just because, I feel like it'll be really quickly decided, you know, final trouble if, only one of them is there. I think if Joe's there with any combination besides Kyle, he wins. I think Kyle wins if he's I
Combination.
think Kyle wins no matter what, even if Joe's there. But still, like,
It would be
I
close.
right. But I think Joe can win against, Camilla, Eva, and Mitch pretty handedly, as well. But I think we're gearing up towards a Joe versus Kyle, final tribal. We've had all these, jury moments in there for a reason. We've had that conversation where I think David was talking about, the jury at some point, and then the one I remember is Mary and Joe's conversation about like, hey, I don't know if that's like when Joe was trying to jury manage Mary
Mhm.
before she was voted out. So that was a whole interesting dynamic as well to think about.
Yeah, 100%. And I think like first off, this challenge, every time you see someone big like Joe, you're like, oh, these challenges like this, you're like, oh, this is meant for like anyone else to win but him. And he just like we saw like Venus like go through this like 14 bazillion times like 2 seasons ago, like this exact same challenge. And Joe did in like felt like only like a couple tries. Like he was killing it. And so that gave me a lot of worry of like he can probably win about any challenge at this
Right.
point. And I think when you look at like specifically like the dynamics of the game, you're right. I think this is really leading to somehow Kyle and Joe having to do something against each other. And it's going to see who has that killer instinct. And I don't know yet.
Yeah, and Jeff said before the season that it's a season of pairs, and we have two very, very strong pairs in the final five. And I think, Mitch is kind of in the middle here, and I think he will side with Kyle and Camilla. And you know, Kyle and Camilla are still under the radar, and they
Mhm.
kept that under the radar. We could talk about that a little bit with the vote because Camilla voted for Mitch, which I do think was a smart move. But it's really hard to say like I was a part of all these decisions with Kyle, when your voting record doesn't really show that. Because you can claim that all you want, but it's hard to like have paper evidence of, that relationship, except for like your knowledge about things. Um, and I think Kyle just has the resume to go far. And I think it's just really hard for him to lose. I just don't see a world where Kyle doesn't win.
I mean, to like, be straight up honest with you, if he won the game like straight up right now, I would argue he's one of the best winners. Like what has he even got a vote? He's idled, yeah. He's gotten 3 votes. But like I can't even blame him. He was swap screwed. You know what I mean?
Right.
And he did a lot of good work to like get out of that. And now he's in a position now, like it's an incredible game. It's a game that like you really dream of. I feel like there's a kind of a like a different step of like Jesse's game from 43 of like, somehow he's like maintained being in this relationship, but no one knows. But I think specifically what he's doing so well is that like he really is letting Camilla take all the blame. That if they got to the end together, like no one's voting for her. Because we see now that like Camilla was the one who told a lie about Shaheen. And Joe was like, okay, like he's constantly putting it where like if things go wrong, he can just sever it off and be like, I don't know, like that's just what I heard. We're not close. and then Camilla's like only lifeline is him. I think it's such good positioning where they are really good like players each, but I think Kyle is actively playing laps around her.
I'd agree with that. I mean, he's the one that's in both sides, of the picture with the alliance. Like he was a part of the Five Alliance, and he's also has the connection with Camilla and therefore the rest of like the bottom people. Whereas, Shaheen, I think we should talk about Shaheen in a second,
Yeah.
and whether or not it was the right move to get rid of him. Um, but Shaheen was like, "Hey, I have connections with all these players," but he never utilized them at all. And I think that would have cost him if he did make it to the end because he made connections with people, but he didn't really follow through with them at all. But I'd say let's ask the question like, was this the right move to take out Shaheen for Kyle and Camilla, or should they have gone with him and taken out Eva instead?
Um, I totally see the rationale of taking Shaheen. You could argue it both ways because in their head they're like, "Hey, we could beat Eva. Like, she has an idol, she's gonna play it. All this stuff." I don't think they're thinking like, "Hey, like we just got to beat Joe in immunity, or anyone else has to win immunity but Joe or Eva, and we can take one of them out." Which I mean is a calculated gamble, and I think Shaheen was probably a bigger threat on the island. When you look at like Kyle, he's like, "Oh, we're in the same spot." Nah, like he was saying we're playing chicken, and Kyle was like, "Okay, you're striking first, I'm striking now." And he was the one who actively took the first strike. And I think that's a good move on his resume where like Shaheen could be like, yeah, like Kyle took me out. And you could see that obviously it was getting to his head. He was like, yeah, I'm the best player here,
Right.
which you're not.
Yeah.
Uh, I think he's probably a better player than his game showed. But I think Shaheen could have made a very good argument at the end for why he should. He's also like a very satisfying option if it's him, Eva, and Joe. Or if everyone's mad at Joe and Eva, like might as well vote for Shaheen.
Right.
And I think overall, like it's a calculated risk. I think voting Eva out there also would have just severed that relationship with Joe completely. But maybe trying to get that idol out, it's just like they're in a tough spot where you're really banking on Joe not winning, and that's just like we've seen it's not good odds.
Right. And at this point, for Kyle, like we can point back at the last two episodes and we can say, oh my gosh, especially like Mitch should have made a move back then. Would have been really smart to, I think in the star vote, that would have been a great time, even though he didn't really have, he had trust issues with Star and Mary, and that would have made it difficult. But we could point to that and say, hey, you should have made that move. I can't point to Kyle and say Kyle should have made a move the last 2 weeks because if he did, I feel like it could have flipped back on him,
I
just like it has, for Shaheen in this one. Even though Shaheen only threw out the name, he never really put a vote behind that either. Um, and so going forward, I think Kyle has such an easy path to the end. He's just gotta win, fire, whatever it takes, to get there. The final five vote, he's
huge.
still in with Eva and Joe. They were part of the plan to take out Shaheen. And then they don't really know they probably have, some awareness that him and Camilla are close, but there's not really it's hard for them to connect that they're working in the game together. But Kyle and Camilla are also close. We don't really know his relationship with Mitch. I feel like I don't know who Mitch is close with at all, just because we haven't seen him very much. But I think Kyle has a connection with all four players besides him, and he has a path, to get to the final four with each of them. And so I just really find it really hard for them to turn on him next week because they're not going to be like, oh my gosh, we have to flip on Kyle. That was like his move to take out Shaheen. They probably Joe and Eva probably see it as like, hey, this was a collective decision to do this because of the intel that he got from Camilla about the idol. So I'm not really sure. That's my read on it. I don't know if that's going to actually happen, but that's my
No,
thought.
that's an excellent read. And I think Mitch is in a really tough spot, and I have like a lot of thoughts on like this round and how it affects next one that we'll talk about in my winner ranking. But I think for Mitch, obviously he's screwed. He's not winning. But to tease that a little, I think we got a lot of setup to the fact that like Mitch takes getting voted for very personally, and Camilla just voted for him. And I do not think that's good unless she told him beforehand. But I think like him going into the next round, he's like, Camilla just voted for me. Like, I might as well just vote for Camilla or like because like, I think that's a very valid way of like how Eva and Joe could get out of that as well. And I do think it's a good plan of like, hey, we're like separated. I think Kyle and Camilla could definitely like swing things and just vote out Mitch. But I also think Mitch could definitely just turn heel and vote out Camilla at the same time, which we've seen that he's a very emotional player. I'm surprised we didn't get a full confessional of him being like, I didn't get taken on reward. This game sucks. Like, because like every episode, I feel like it's just him being upset about not being on reward. So that's just where my head's at with that, with Mitch. But I do think Kyle and Camilla are playing like so well, and I don't even blame them for voting Mitch. Like, odds are it won't matter.
Right. I really don't know. I think if Joe wins immunity, I think, the person going home, because, Eva will play her idol. She if she'd be really dumb to not play her idol at the final five. And I think at that point, Kyle has to make the decision to turn on Camilla. Or, I mean, at least like one of
He
them
has to
has to
think.
make it to the end. I think it has to be Camilla at final five if Joe wins. Um, and then, which is really sad because I've loved Camille on this season, but it would
He's
take
such
a
a
lot
good
for her to
professional.
win. I know. And then going into the final four, at that point you have Joe, Eva, Kyle, Mitch. You know Joe probably wins again. Let's be real. It depends on the challenge, but let's say Joe wins, he's in. He's gonna take Eva, Mitch and Kyle to fire making, and I think just with the edit, Kyle wins fire, and then we have a big showdown in the final tribal council. That's my prediction.
I think that's a really good prediction. I could also totally see a world where Joe's like, Kyle, me and you are in fire making, and like whoever wins it all. Like one of those like one of those like Rick Devens sort of things. But I do think you're right. I think it's either gonna be a final four or final tribal. Like it's coming to a head, and we kind of got like a little bit of teasing with that where they're like, Kyle and Camilla were like, one of us like we have to go for each other at this point. Which I don't know if I mean, this sounds like Joe or even want immunity, but I do think on a quick rant, this is why I hate Final Four fire making, because Kyle would have had the game won, easily would have had the game won, because now Joe only has to win one immunity, and like if Eva or Joe wins Final Four, like he's in. I think Kyle set up the game where like if he had the Final Four vote, he has the game almost completely on lock. Where
Right.
Joe would have break the record in immunities to get it done, which I love Joe, not gonna happen. And flashback to this when it happens.
I know.
Where like he would have gone to the end with Camilla, beaten her, taken her out at four, something, and like had the game on lock. And obviously this is a reason why Jeff put it in, so people like Joe does have a chance, but man,
I
it's
mean,
taken
I
away.
just don't think it matters. Joe hasn't done anything, and he has been on the wrong side of the intel, the last few moves. Like he was not on the right side of the intel with the David move. He wasn't on the right side of the intel now, with the
Oh, what
Shahin
I'm
move.
saying is like he's just gonna get to the end somehow through immunities and fire making when I think Kyle would have voted him out before that. I think Kyle is like if Kyle is at the end, he wins.
I'd agree with that no matter what.
Yeah.
And I don't think at this point, like, I don't really think there's going to be a tie. Um, just because, let's say I'm reading a little bit into the edit here, a lot of bit into the edit, sorry, but I just don't see a world with the tie because if, I mean, unless it's an all guy final three, and if they tie at that point, I would see Mitch voting for Kyle to win for the
Yeah.
tiebreaker vote. But if Eva's with Eva and Joe and Kyle are there, Eva's for sure voting Joe. So,
And Camilla would vote Kyle.
yeah. So I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I agree. And I feel like if it was going to a tie, from the one season we have seen a tie, I mean, the edit was just like, funny enough, the season's been very much compared to Ghost Island.
Right.
And, but that season was completely dominated by those two. Like, from pretty much, I don't know, from episode like 4 on, you knew that this was like the Dom and Wendell show. And this was all about like who was Laura going to pick at the end, and we were shown why. And we haven't got really the setup here for like someone breaking the tie. Like even in 46, like we got set up to like who would Ben choose? Like would he have picked like Kinsey or Charlie? Which like the edit was misleading. He would have picked Charlie. But stuff like that where we don't really get that here. We know who everyone would pick, and we know Mitch is not going to break the tie because we don't Mitch hasn't been shown to really talk to either of Kyle or
Yeah.
Joe.
I just don't see like Mitch's connections in the game, anything like that, which is really sad. He
Yeah,
had two
which
confessionals in the final six episode. There's six people left.
which pushing into the edit some more, which kind of makes me think he's not the Final Five boot, because the Final Five boot is usually a very high confession list. Sorry, Camilla, that's my prediction. But I mean, like, there's been some that have been boring, but like, I think Mitch is making it to the end. Anyways, I think I should ask you the biggest question of the night: idols or no idols?
Is that the biggest question of the night?
Oh, it's the biggest question.
Oh my gosh. As soon as I heard that that was the last voting like thing for season 50, I was like, are you kidding me? It's the illusion of choice that we've had in this Survivor 50 vote. I don't care that much. I'm mad though, because Jeff made it, hey, it's in the hands of the fans. If that is gonna still be the name of the season when, the players are on the beach here in a couple weeks, you know, it's pretty misleading. We've had very vague things to vote on. The first wave got me excited about it because we had a lot of fun things to talk about, fire making, the live finale. But since then we've gotten these, really obscure worded, like, cryptic, are we gonna have strategic advantages, or, are we gonna
Epic
have are we gonna
advances.
have, crazy twists? Or like, they've been very, wordy and not really descriptive. And so I don't really know what we're voting for because those broad categories could be anything. The game makers, they're doing everything. We don't really have control over that. But when we can look at whether or not there's going to be a fire making challenge, in the final four next season, that's an actual concrete thing we can see. With the idols, very concrete. But there's only one category, like are
Give
you
us some
like you got to give us more than that? We're
journey.
here like
Like,
journeys, no journeys, mergatory, no mergatory. Some of these new era things that we've seen pretty outspoken in the superfan community that are not really favored. I'm
no
curious
race
to see
negotiation.
what the votes would be for like your broad base of Survivor fans that watch each week. And so, of course, there's going to be idols in Survivor 50. There's no chance that we're going to have more than 50% of people vote no idols. Um, I don't think anyone wants to see that. I think the only interesting thing that would add is everyone would think that there's probably still idols in the game. And I don't know. That might make it interesting, but it just doesn't matter that much. Idols have caused, so many entertaining moments since season 11. It's kind of hard to know the game without idols at this point, and I think it would be pretty boring if there was, let's think about this. There's going to be advantages in the game. We had to vote on the three
Yeah,
different categories of advantages. There's going to be advantages, but what if there's advantages and no idols? Like, there's no shot.
yeah, it just doesn't make sense. And I know he like this was one of the original ones he like put forth and everything, and everyone's like, oh, okay. But like this being the last one, I'm really hoping that they just like switch it up and they're like, we got one more vote, and it's like, oh, okay. but I really doubt it.
Mhm.
I was hoping for like, obviously they weren't going to do Final Three, Final Two, but there are little things you can do here and there, like even the immunity necklace, like even though that was like, I was like, all right, just lateral move, but it was like at least fun to like vote on that instead of
Yeah.
having just like idols or no idols. It's like obviously like arguably like the greatest moves in Survivor history are all like with idols, except for like maybe like two of them. Like you need idols in the game because imagine they bring back like Rick Devens. Like that guy lived off of idols. What is
True.
he gonna do out there? The whole point is watching like for example, Winners at War. Like them looking for idols was honestly very interesting. Seeing people like use it as a social game. Like specifically Ben using it like I know how to find idols. I'm gonna use this to build trust. Like say what you want about Ben, but that's genius. He knows his worth. Like I I don't know like why that's the only one. It's very
Yeah,
disappointing. But
I'd agree. Not a lot to talk about there, but I would like to talk a little bit about the cast for a bit if you'd like to do that.
yes, I would love to.
Just like, what are your thoughts on the rumored cast? And that's kind of, you know, changed a lot, but
I have
over the
not
last few
seen
weeks.
the new rumored class. Do you have any big names that have come out?
They're pretty consistent.
So like Stephanie, like Colby.
Sorry, let me pull that up. Here's the cast speculation. 90 to 100% on the cast per Redmond. We have Colby and Elizabeth from Australia. We have Stephanie. We have Sari, Ozzy, Amanda, Philip, or Eric, which is the male. But I think it could also be Malcolm there. I probably think it's Malcolm. Chrissy Hoffbeck, Christian and Angelina, Jonathan, Emily Flippin, and we have Q and Charlie from 46, Genevieve, and then one of Joe, Kyle, or Shaheen, perhaps the winner from Survivor 48. And so those are some interesting picks. Winners are now back in the picture, which that for me, I think that's probably going to be D. But we could also see someone like Rachel. We could even see, the Sepia, Earl, some of these older winners that have never returned. There's, the possibility for that. And then been called, no confirmation for like Rob Sesternino, Nino, which I'm really hoping for. I'd love for him to play. Um, it looks like um, Lex was called, but probably cut. Um, and then I see Rupert, Ty, and Julia from Korong, and I also see Xander and Shan as well. And Say's been hinting a lot on social media. I think she's trolling though, because I don't think they're gonna have a pre-merger on season 50. So,
Absolutely not. But
but those are some of the names that are out there. What are your thoughts on those?
I think that's a great cast. Like I think that's a very good mix of like old school like legends and like potential new legends. Like obviously Angelina, Christian have become almost like legends just from the one run. But like you get people like Charlie, Q, like two people that were like pretty like specifically Q was like arguably the biggest character outside of Carolyn of the new era. And like I think Genevieve's such a good choice. I think she has a lot of potential to do well. And I kind of like this cast. I think it'd be a good mix. And then I think it sounds to me, they really want like a good winner. This really, I've said it a lot, but this really does sound like a best to never win, which is kind of why I hope they don't bring back winners. But I hope they bring back Jam Jam. I love Jam Jam. But it's more likely D because I don't know. Jeff Caesar has like the new Boston Rob, and Jeff would lose his left arm if it
Yeah,
meant
and
Boston
I
was
think
sick.
I didn't mention Devins as well. He's definitely in the mix.
Oh
I
yeah.
think he's keeping it pretty low key though. So I think we're looking at mostly like Jeff's podcast guests are all in the mix for On Fire, which is makes sense because it's players that he enjoys. And to me, this season reminds me of like the Game Changers cast in a way, not like to the extent where you're picking these random people, but like just like throughout all the eras, kind of just a wide variety of players with like intermix of winners. It's just Game Changer to me is just a pretty random cast in general.
Mhm.
But I'm excited for it. I hope it lives up to the hype and players come out there to play, and it's exciting.
Think they
And
will.
I do think this will close the book on like pre-new era returnees, for the most part. We'll see. I don't think it'll close the book completely. But I think when you're looking at some of these older classic seasons, we're probably never going to see any of these players again. Um, but I do think we're going to have another All-Star season,
I
like
agree.
or two in the 50s. Um, not including 60. Um, like some sort of captains, they could
Hmm.
throw in a fans versus favorites, something like that. Second chances. I could see all those happening as well. But that's the cast. It seems pretty interesting. We'll probably have a few randos that make it on the cast that we like that are not rumored at all. And so
Bono, it's like, oh my gosh,
Bonnie makes the cut.
what happened to the show I loved?
No, but anyways, it's been really great talking about this episode. It's been really fun to just dive in. Rip Shaheen, you're a great character on this season. Enjoyed watching him play. Um, I I thought he was in a really good spot for most of the game until last week. And that kind of went down from there. But I don't know. We'll see what happens in this finale. I'm really excited for it. So join us on Saturday. We are planning to talk about our predictions for the finale, which I got in a little bit here, but also winner equity rankings, which I also got into a little bit here. But we'll do more of
Yeah.
that. Have a deeper conversation, talk through all the scenarios on Saturday. So stay tuned for that, and then go ahead and watch next week for our finale recap and get ready for our off-season stuff. So be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you guys next time.
See ya.